Tonight, we will explore the surprisingly rich and strange history of the chair, from the jewel-encrusted thrones of Egyptian pharaohs to the cheap white plastic chair you might find in a garden or a street cafe on literally any continent on Earth. The chair carries 10,000 years of human ambition, social hierarchy, and the quiet, persistent desire to simply be comfortable. It is a story about power, craft, revolution, and what we choose to put beneath us when we need to rest. So find your spot, whether that is in bed, curled up on the couch, or settled somewhere soft and familiar. Let the day go, and let yourself drift into a world where even the most ordinary object turns out to have the most extraordinary past. Chapter 1. The era of authority, when chairs were thrones. There is something worth pausing on before we go anywhere else in this story. Before the first Egyptian carpenter ever shaped a piece of acacia wood into a throne, before the Greeks carved their elegant curved seats, before any of that, human beings simply sat on the ground. And for most of our history, that was perfectly fine. The earth was the chair. A rock was the chair. A fallen log, a woven mat, a folded animal, skin pressed flat against the dirt. These were the seats of everyday life. If you go far enough back, the most natural resting position for a human body was not the 90-degree posture we now associate with sitting in a chair. It was a squat, low and balanced, heels near the ground, knees wide, the whole body folded in on itself in a way that most adults in the modern world can no longer comfortably achieve for more than a few seconds. This matters because it means the chair, as we understand it today, is not a natural extension of the human body. It is a cultural invention. And like so many cultural inventions, it did not begin as something practical. It began as something political. The earliest chairs we have evidence of were not made for comfort. They were made for distance. The distance between one person and everyone else in the room. To sit elevated with your back supported and your arms resting on something solid was to announce to everyone around you that you were not like them, that you did not need to crouch on the floor, that the world arranged itself around your position, not the other way around. In ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, this language of seating was refined into something almost theological. The pharaoh did not simply sit in a chair. He sat in a throne, and the throne was not furniture. It was a cosmological statement. The word for throne in ancient Egypt was closely bound to the goddess Isis herself, whose name and iconography were sometimes represented as a throne symbol worn atop her head, suggesting that the seat of power was not merely occupied by the divine ruler, but was itself a form of divinity. To sit upon the throne was to merge with something sacred. The physical objects themselves reflected this. Chairs and thrones recovered from ancient Egyptian tombs. And the most famous of these come from the tomb of Tutankhamun, discovered in the early 20th century, are objects of extraordinary craftsmanship. Tutankhamun's golden throne, which is probably the most well-preserved royal chair from the ancient world, is covered in gold and silver, inlaid with colored glass and semi-precious stones, and decorated with intricate scenes of royal life. The legs of the chair are shaped like the legs of a lion, a detail that appears again and again in ancient Egyptian furniture and carried a deep symbolic weight. The lion was strength, power, the capacity to destroy. To sit on something with lion's legs was to absorb that energy, to embody it. But beyond the decoration, there was a simpler and perhaps more psychologically powerful piece of design at work. And that was as height. The height of your seat in the ancient world told everyone in the room exactly where you stood in the order of things. A pharaoh's throne sat on a raised platform. Courtiers might be permitted low stools, simple wooden seats without backs, things that kept them off the ground but made absolutely clear they were not equal to the figure above them. Everyone else sat on the floor or stood. The gradient of seating was a map of social reality. You could read the entire hierarchy of a court just by looking at who was sitting where and how high off the ground they happened to be. This was not unique to Egypt. In Mesopotamia, in the civilizations of Sumer and Babylon and Assyria, similar principles applied. Stone carvings and cylinder seals from these cultures show rulers seated on high-backed chairs while supplicants stand before them or kneel. The chair in these images is not incidental. It is doing enormous symbolic work. It is saying, quietly and firmly, that the person in it belongs to a different category of existence than the people standing around them. For most ordinary people in both Egypt and Mesopotamia, elaborate seating simply did not exist. Daily life involved mats, low platforms, chests that doubled as seats, and a great deal of sitting cross-legged or crouching near the ground. The chair with the back and arms was an aristocratic object, almost without exception, and it remained so for a very long time. Then something interesting began to happen in ancient Greece, somewhere around the 5th century before the Common Era. And it is interesting because it was not a revolution in who had access to chairs, but rather a revolution in how chairs were thought about and designed. The Greeks created something called the klismos, and the klismos is, to many historians of design, one of the most quietly remarkable objects in the ancient world. It had 4 legs that curved outward from the seat, splaying gently away from the body of the chair in a way that created natural stability without rigidity. The back was a simple curved slat, a single piece of wood bent into a concave shape that followed the natural curve of a human spine. There were no arms. The whole thing was light, elegant, and balanced. And what is striking about it, especially in contrast to the massive jewel-encrusted thrones of Egypt, is that it looks comfortable, not powerful, comfortable. You can see the klismos in Greek vase paintings and stone reliefs throughout this period. Women are often depicted sitting in them, which is itself significant, suggesting that this was not purely a throne of authority, but something that had moved, at least slightly, into the realm of domestic life and personal ease. Figures are shown relaxed, limbs at rest, the body settling into the curve of the backrest rather than sitting rigid and upright in a posture of command. This feels, in retrospect, like a small philosophical shift made visible in wood. The Greeks, who were at this moment developing ideas about proportion, balance, the human body as a measure of all things, seemed to have applied those same ideas to furniture. The klismos was designed around the body rather than around status. It fit the person sitting in it rather than making a declaration about who that person was. Of course, it was still reserved for the elite. The Greek world was not a democracy in the way we use that word. And ordinary citizens, slaves, laborers, none of them were furnishing their homes with beautifully crafted curved back chairs. But the idea, the seed of the idea, that a chair might serve the person rather than project power over everyone in the room, that idea was beginning to take shape. The Romans took a somewhat different path, or perhaps more accurately, they took both paths at once, because the Romans were extraordinarily good at holding contradictions together in a single object. The curule chair which was the seat of Roman magistrates and senior officials, was a folding stool essentially. It had curved legs that crossed in an X shape, and it could be collapsed and carried, which meant that a Roman magistrate could bring his authority with him wherever he went. This was not incidental. The Roman Empire was, among other things, a vast project of legal and administrative projection, an attempt to extend Roman order across an enormous and varied geography. And the curule chair was part of that projection. When a Roman official sat down in his curule chair in some distant province, in Gaul or North Africa or the Eastern Mediterranean, he was not simply taking a seat. He was instantiating Rome itself. He was saying, with his body and his furniture, that the law had arrived. The garule was traditionally made of ivory, or at least decorated with it, and its use was restricted by law to specific offices. The consuls could use it. Certain praetors and censors could use it. Others could not. There were rules about who sat where and in what kind of chair, and those rules were enforced seriously because everyone understood that seating was not a trivial matter. It was a grammar of power, and deviating from it was a kind of political statement in itself. What is remarkable, looking at the ancient world as a whole, is how consistently and independently this same idea emerged across cultures that had limited contact with one another. The elevated seat, the ornate throne, the chair as a visual marker of authority. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, in Greece, in Rome, and elsewhere in the ancient world, people arrived again and again at the same conclusion, that how you sit tells everyone around you who you are. The chair was not just furniture. It was a sentence in a language that everyone already knew how to read, even if no one had ever explicitly taught them its grammar. And that language, as we will see, did not disappear when Rome fell. It simply found new rooms to speak in. Chapter 2, The Middle, Ages and Renaissance, From Chests to the Home. There is something quietly humbling about imagining the centuries that followed the fall of Rome. All that accumulated knowledge, all that craft and engineering and philosophical curiosity slowly dissolving into a long, difficult silence. The great cities emptied, the trade routes narrowed, and the furniture, perhaps more than anything else, tells that story with a strange and intimate clarity. When the Roman Empire fractured in the West around the late 5th century, something happened to the domestic world of ordinary people that rarely gets mentioned in history books. The chair, that carefully considered object that Roman magistrates and Greek philosophers had used to express authority and refinement, largely disappeared from everyday life, not immediately and not completely, but gradually, across generations, the presence of elaborate seating simply faded away. What replaced it was something far more practical and, in its own way, far more honest about the conditions people were actually living in. The early medieval period in Europe was not a stable time. That much is well known. But what that instability meant for the way people organized their homes, their belongings, and their daily routines is worth sitting with for a moment. Many communities were semi-nomadic, or at least accustomed to the idea that they might need to move at short notice. A lord defending a territory might relocate his household multiple times in a year. Raiding parties, shifting alliances, crop failures, plague. All of these things meant that the idea of accumulating heavy, fixed furniture was not just impractical, it was almost philosophically at odds with the way life worked. You carried what you could, you left behind what you couldn't, and so the chest emerged. It's easy to underestimate the chest or the cassone as it was called in Italian households later in the medieval period, because we think of it now as a simple passive thing, something you keep blankets in, tucked at the foot of a bed. But for several hundred years, the chest was arguably the most important piece of furniture a family could own. It was storage, yes, keeping grain dry, protecting cloth and documents, and whatever valuables a household might possess. But it was also a table when you needed one, a raised surface to work on or to eat from. It was a bed in a pinch, or at least a sleeping platform. And it was a seat. You sat on your chest. You gathered around it. The chest was the center of the room in a way that no single object in a modern home quite is anymore. There is something almost poignant about that image. A family in a modest stone hall somewhere in northern France or the English countryside, gathered around a wooden chest in the firelight, eating their supper from its flat lid. No chairs with backs, no cushions usually. Just the hard edge of a box that also held everything they owned. The chairs that did exist in this period were almost exclusively for the powerful, and they carried that weight very deliberately. A king's chair or a lord's chair at the head of a great hall was not a comfortable place to perch. It was a statement. It was tall, often elaborately carved, fitted with arms that extended outward like the rigid embrace of authority. To sit in such a chair was to occupy a different category of human being from everyone else in the room, who sat on benches, stools, or simply stood. This is where a phrase that you almost certainly use today has its quiet origin. When we call someone a chairman, when we say that a professor holds a chair at a university, when a committee meeting opens and someone is announced as taking the chair, we are using language that was shaped in these great halls, in these cold medieval rooms where the distinction between who sat in the high-backed chair and who did not was one of the most visible and immediate signals of social order available. The chair in this world was not a place to rest. It was a place to reign. Only the head of the household sat in the chair. Only the bishop in his diocese. Only the judge in his court. Everyone else found another way to rest their body, because occupying that seat without permission was not an act of comfort. It was an act of transgression. It is difficult now, from the inside of a world where we own perhaps a dozen chairs without thinking about it, to feel how charged that single piece of furniture once was. But the language has carried the memory forward for us, quietly, without us noticing. As the medieval centuries continued and very slowly, conditions in parts of Europe began to stabilize. Small changes started to appear. Monasteries became centers of learning and craft. Towns grew up around cathedrals. Trade routes, tentative at first, began to reopen along rivers and coastlines. And with stability came something that furniture always responds to, the luxury of accumulation. When you are no longer preparing, consciously or unconsciously, to move or be displaced, you begin to invest in your surroundings. You put down roots, and roots eventually grow into furniture. By the later medieval period, perhaps the 13th and 14th centuries, more elaborate chairs were appearing in the homes of wealthy merchants and minor nobility. They were still heavy, still architectural in their proportions, still carved from oak in ways that announced their permanence. Many of them incorporated the chest directly, with a hinged seat that lifted to reveal storage underneath. This was not design in any decorative sense. It was pragmatism layered on pragmatism. But it was also the beginning of a slow cultural shift. The chair becoming something that more than one kind of person might aspire to own. Then came the Renaissance, and with it, a change in the emotional relationship between people and their domestic spaces that is difficult to overstate. The Renaissance is usually talked about in terms of painting, sculpture, the rediscovery of classical texts, the flowering of humanism. And all of that is real and important. But it also represented something more intimate and more everyday, a growing belief that the physical world around you, including the objects in your home, was worthy of beauty and attention. That comfort was not a moral failing, that the body, seated and at rest, deserved consideration. The merchant class in cities like Florence, Venice, Bruges, and later London was accumulating wealth at a pace that hadn't been seen in the West for centuries. And with wealth came the desire to live well, not just to display power, but to experience pleasure in the domestic sphere. The home began to be imagined, perhaps for the first time in a broad social sense, as a place of personal refuge, a place where the aesthetic choices of the inhabitants mattered and spoke to something about their inner life as well as their status. The chair was transformed by this shift. It began to be upholstered. This sounds like a small thing, and in purely functional terms perhaps it was, but it represented a fundamental change in what a chair was for. Upholstery meant fabric, and fabric meant softness, and softness meant that the person sitting down was being considered as a body with sensations and preferences, not merely as a figure who needed to be elevated above the floor. Early Renaissance upholstery was often leather, stretched over a wooden frame and secured with decorative nails. Later, it became velvet and silk and embroidered cloth, materials that spoke of wealth, but also of a genuine interest in physical ease. The proportions of chairs also began to change. The great Gothic thrones of the medieval hall, those massive carved monuments to hierarchical order, gave way to something slightly more human in its scale. Backs became curved, arms were repositioned at heights where they might actually support a resting elbow rather than simply exist as architectural features. There was still status encoded in every carving, every gilded detail, every choice of material. The Renaissance was not an age of equality, but the conversation that furniture was having with the human body began to shift from one of pure dominance to something that included, for the first time in a very long while, a whisper of care. It is worth noting that this democratization was still extremely relative. When we say the chair became available to the merchant class, we are talking about a narrow slice of society, wealthy traders, successful guild masters, ambitious professionals in prosperous cities. The vast majority of people in Renaissance Europe were still sitting on benches, on stools, or on the ground. The chest was still the center of most homes, but the direction had changed. The chair was beginning its long, slow journey from the throne room toward the ordinary room. From the symbol of a single, elevated authority toward something that, many centuries later, would end up in every kitchen, every classroom, every waiting room on earth. That journey had barely begun by the time the 16th century closed, but something had shifted in the imagination of the domestic world, something quiet and persistent. The idea that the way you sat at home was connected to the way you understood yourself. Chapter 3. The 18th century. The pursuit of leisure and posture. By the 1700s, something quiet but profound had shifted in the way human beings thought about their bodies, their time, and their homes. For centuries, sitting had been mostly a question of power or necessity. You sat to project authority, or you sat because you were too tired to stand. Comfort as a deliberate goal in the design of furniture was a relatively new idea, but the 18th century would change that, slowly and luxuriously. beginning in the gilded salons of Paris and spreading eventually to the wooden porches of rural America. France, at this moment in history, was the cultural center of the Western world. Under the long shadows of Louis XIV and later Louis XIV, Paris was not simply a city, but a kind of performance, a stage where taste, intellect, and social ambition were constantly on display. The aristocracy and the rising wealthy merchant class gathered in the salons, those elegant private rooms hosted usually by women of education and influence, where philosophy was debated, reputations were made or ruined, and the art of conversation was treated almost as a religion. These gatherings could last for hours. People arrived in the afternoon and stayed well into the evening, talking, drinking tea or chocolate, flirting, arguing about Voltaire or Rousseau or the latest scandal at court. And here is where the chair becomes interesting again. If you're going to sit for several hours in animated conversation, you need a different kind of chair than the stiff high-backed thrones of previous centuries. You need something that holds the body gently, that allows you to lean forward with interest or recline with elegance, that communicates ease rather than dominance. The French furniture makers of this period, extraordinarily skilled craftsmen working in the tradition of the royal workshops, began designing chairs that responded directly to this social need. The fauteuil emerged as perhaps the defining chair of this culture. The word is simply the French term for armchair, but saying it that way hardly captures what the fauteuil was. It had a padded seat, padded armrests, and a padded back, often covered in silk or velvet or fine embroidered fabric that matched the wallpaper or the curtains of the room. Its legs were curved and carved, sometimes gilded. It was a chair designed to receive the body with warmth, to make the sitter look composed and comfortable at the same time. Sitting in a fauteuil, you were not merely resting. You were presenting yourself in a particular way, graceful and at ease, which in that world was its own form of power. Then there was the bergère, a deeper and more enveloping version of the armchair, with upholstered panels filling the spaces between the armrests and the seat, so that the sides of the chair were solid and cushioned rather than open. It was a chair for longer, more private hours, for reading by a window, for an afternoon when you had nowhere particular to be. The bergère asked more of you in terms of relaxation. It essentially cradled you. It is, in many ways, the ancestor of every oversized lounge chair that has existed since. One detail from this period is easy to overlook, but reveals something charming about how deeply social life shaped design. Women of the French aristocracy and upper classes wore dresses with extraordinarily wide skirts, supported by structures called panniers, or later, wider hooped underskirts. These garments could extend several feet on either side of the wearer's body. Sitting down while wearing such a dress required some creative thinking. Armchairs with their fixed armrests were simply impossible for many formal occasions. So furniture makers developed a specific type of chair, sometimes called the chaise en cabriolet, or simply a side chair that had no arms at all, allowing a woman in full formal dress to sit without the skirt being crushed or the armrests being pushed aside. The shape of fashion literally reshaped the shape of furniture. It is a reminder that design is almost never purely abstract. It responds to real bodies, in real clothes, in real social situations. While Paris was perfecting the art of leisured sitting, something entirely different was happening across the English Channel and then across the Atlantic Ocean. The Windsor chair was not a product of royal workshops or aristocratic salons. Its exact origins are a little unclear, and different historians offer different accounts. But the Windsor appears to have emerged in England sometime in the early 18th century, possibly in the rural areas around the Thames Valley, before making its way to urban workshops and eventually to the American colonies. What made the Windsor chair remarkable was not elegance, but engineering. It was built around a thick solid wooden seat into which the legs and the back spindles were inserted at angles like a porcupine's quills, each one angled slightly outward to give stability. The back was made of thin, rounded wooden rods, spindles, that fanned upward from the seat and bent at the top into a curved rail that your back could rest against. There were no complicated joints, no glue holding frame to frame in the manner of formal furniture. Instead, everything was plugged into that central seat, and the whole structure was held together by tension and the slight flex of the wood. This sounds simple, but the result was a chair of surprising durability. Because the spindles could move just a little, the chair could absorb stress rather than crack under it. It was light enough to carry with one hand. It could be made from several different kinds of wood at once, since each part had a different requirement. The seat from elm for its resistance to splitting, the legs from ash or oak for their hardness, the spindles from a more flexible wood that could be turned and shaped easily. It was a chair built from what was available and what worked, and was unpretentious about it. In the American colonies and later in the young United States, the Windsor chair became ubiquitous. Colonial craftsmen adapted the English design and made it their own, creating variations with different back shapes and proportions. It furnished taverns and meeting halls and farmhouses. There is a reasonable chance, though I would not want to state it as a certainty, that the chairs in the room where the Declaration of Independence was signed were Windsor chairs. It was the chair of ordinary working life, and it carried none of the aristocratic associations of French furniture. It was simply useful and honest and everywhere. The rocking chair deserves its own moment here because it is one of those inventions that seems almost too simple to have needed inventing, and yet once it existed, became deeply embedded in a particular way of life. The idea is just a chair placed on two curved runners so that it moves back and forth with the sitter's weight. That gentle, repetitive motion turns out to be profoundly soothing to the human nervous system, something that people who have ever held a restless baby already understand instinctively. Benjamin Franklin is sometimes credited with inventing the rocking chair, and while that story has circulated for a long time, most historians are cautious about it. The evidence is not conclusive, and the rocking chair likely evolved gradually from the simple act of attaching curved rockers to existing chair legs, something that might have been done independently by multiple craftsmen in different places. What we can say is that the rocking chair became distinctly and deeply American in its cultural associations, in a way that went far beyond any single inventor. In America, the rocking chair became connected to a whole constellation of ideas about rest, healing, and the rhythms of domestic life. Doctors in the 18th and 19th centuries sometimes recommended rocking chairs for people recovering from illness, believing that the motion aided digestion and calmed the nervous system. Mothers rocked infants to sleep in them. Elderly people spent their afternoons in them on the porch. The image of an older man or woman in a rocking chair looking out over a yard or a field became almost a symbol of a life well and fully lived. The reward that came at the end of decades of work. The porch itself is important here. American domestic architecture, particularly in the South and in rural areas, embraced the covered porch as a transitional space between the private home and the outside world. And the rocking chair belonged perfectly to that in-between space. You were outside enough to feel the air and watch the world, but sheltered enough to stay for hours. The rhythm of the rocking matched the slower pace of that kind of time, time that was not productive exactly, but that was deeply necessary. What the 18th century ultimately gave us, across all these different chairs and cultures, was the idea that how we sit could be a form of care for ourselves, not just a reflection of power or status, not just a practical necessity, but an acknowledgement that the body deserves to be comfortable, that rest has value, that the quality of your hours of repose is worth thinking carefully about. That idea, once planted, would only grow. Chapter 4. The Industrial Revolution, Mass Production, Changes Everything. There is something quietly melancholy about the end of a craft, not a dramatic collapse, but a slow fading. The way a candle doesn't quite go out all at once, but simply becomes less and less itself until the room is dark. That is roughly what happened to the chairmaker in the 19th century. And it is worth sitting with that image for a moment before we move on to what replaced it. For centuries, making a chair was a life's work in the most literal sense. A young boy would be apprenticed to a master craftsman, sometimes as early as 12 or 13 years old, and he would spend years, sometimes a full decade, learning the trade from the ground up. He would learn which woods bend without splitting and which ones cracked under pressure. He would learn to feel with his hands whether a joint was tight enough to last a generation. He would learn the rhythm of the lathe, the patience of sanding, the particular satisfaction of a chair that didn't wobble even slightly when you set it on an uneven floor. By the time he became a master himself, he carried the knowledge of his craft not just in his mind but in his muscles, his fingertips, the angle of his wrist. And then, gradually and then all at once, the factories came. Steam power changed everything, not just for furniture, but for almost every object that human hands had previously made. What had required years of apprenticeship could now be broken into smaller, simpler, repeatable steps. One worker would cut, another would sand, another would assemble, another would finish. No single person needed to understand the whole. The workshop, which had been a place of accumulated wisdom, became a place of fragmented tasks. Chairs began rolling off assembly lines in numbers that would have seemed incomprehensible to a craftsman from even 50 years earlier. They were cheaper. Yes, they were faster. Absolutely. But something quieter had been lost somewhere in the noise of the machines. This is not a romanticization of poverty. Artisan craftsmen worked brutal hours for uncertain pay, and many of them lived difficult lives. The industrial age brought chairs to people who had never owned one before, which is genuinely significant. But it is worth acknowledging that the shift carried a cost that was not measured in money. Into this moment of transformation walked a man who somehow managed to do both things at once, to embrace the industrial age fully and to produce something that was unmistakably beautiful. His name was Michael Tonet, and if you have ever sat in a simple curved wooden chair at a café, the kind with a round seat and a back made of graceful loops, you have sat in his legacy. Tonet was born in 1796 in a small town in what is now Germany, and he began his career as a traditional cabinet maker. He was talented, disciplined, and apparently possessed of an almost obsessive curiosity about the properties of wood. For years, he experimented with something that sounds almost counterintuitive when you first hear it: the idea of bending solid wood into curves using steam. The prevailing assumption at the time was that if you wanted a curved piece of furniture, You carved it from a block, or you built it up in layers. Bending solid wood risked splitting it, warping it, ruining it entirely. Tone disagreed, or rather, he suspected that the disagreement was not with the wood itself, but with the method. His process, which he refined over many years and eventually patented, involved soaking solid rods of beechwood in hot water or steam until they became, for a brief and crucial window of time, almost pliable. In that softened state, the wood could be pressed into metal forms and held there until it cooled and dried, at which point it retained its new shape permanently. The curves were not carved or constructed. They were coaxed out of the wood itself, as if the wood had always wanted to be curved and simply needed to be given permission. The results were elegant in a way that felt both effortless and inevitable. Tonette's bent wood pieces had a fluidity that carved furniture rarely achieved, because carved curves always carry the faint impression of struggle, of material removed, of effort. His curves felt grown rather than made. He moved to Vienna in the 1840s after catching the attention of the Austrian Chancellor Prince Metternich, who was impressed enough to commission him for work at one of his palaces. Vienna was the right city at the right moment. The Austrian Empire was wealthy, its middle class was growing, and there was an appetite for furniture that was elegant without being ostentatiously aristocratic. Tonette's bentwood pieces fit that appetite perfectly. But the chair that would define his legacy, and in a very real sense help define what modern furniture could be, came later. Chair number 14, introduced in 1859, was not his most elaborate design. In fact, its genius lay almost entirely in its lack of elaboration. It was made from just 6 pieces of bent beechwood, 10 screws, and 2 nuts. The seat was a simple circle of quine. The back was a graceful loop. The legs curved slightly outward for stability. There were no carvings, no inlays, no upholstery, no decoration of any kind that wasn't also structural. It was, in the most generous and precise sense of the word, pure. And it could be taken apart completely. This was the detail that changed everything. The 6 pieces of the chair could be packed flat into a small crate, and an extraordinary number of chairs, something in the range of 36 fully assembled chairs worth of components, could fit into a single cubic meter of shipping space. You would pack the parts, ship them anywhere in the world, and assemble them on arrival with nothing more than basic tools and a few minutes of effort. If that sounds familiar to you, it should. This was flat-pack furniture, conceived and executed more than a century before the word became synonymous with a particular Swedish warehouse. The implications were enormous. For the first time, a single chair design could be manufactured in one place and sold almost anywhere on earth without the prohibitive cost of shipping bulky assembled furniture. Tonette's factories, which eventually spread across Central Europe and employed thousands of workers, could produce chair now, 14 at a cost so low that it became accessible to a class of people who had previously furnished their homes with whatever they could afford, which was often very little. The chair spread through Europe and then the world with a quiet, democratic thoroughness. It became the default chair of the Viennese coffee house, that particular institution where intellectuals and artists and ordinary people sat for hours over a single cup, reading newspapers, arguing about philosophy, or simply watching the street. Sigmund Freud reportedly owned dozens of them. Le Corbusier, the great modernist architect, called it the most distinguished chair in the world, which is a remarkable thing for one of the 20th century's most original designers to say about a chair invented 50 years before his time. By 1930, Tonet's company had sold approximately 50 million units of chair Neoferon 50 million. The number is almost difficult to hold in your mind. It means that a single design, conceived by a single man experimenting with steam and beechwood in a modest workshop, had become one of the most reproduced objects in human history. It had traveled to cafés in Paris and Buenos Aires, to hotels in New York and Bombay, to restaurants and waiting rooms and private dining rooms on nearly every continent. What Tonet had proven, perhaps without fully intending to, was that beauty and affordability were not opposites. The assumption that had governed design for most of human history, that fine things were by definition expensive things, and that cheap things were by definition ugly things, was not actually a law of nature. It was a habit of thought. Chair number 52 was, by almost any aesthetic measure, a lovely object, and it cost almost nothing. This was a genuinely radical idea, and its ripples extended far beyond furniture. It suggested that the industrial age, for all the damage it was doing to craft traditions, was also capable of something that craft traditions had rarely achieved, putting well-designed objects into the hands of ordinary people. The democratization of quality, which would become one of the defining aspirations of 20th century design, begins in a meaningful way here, in a bentwood chair in a Viennese café, stacked casually in the corner, waiting for the next customer to pull it out and sit down without giving it a second thought. That indifference, in its own strange way, is the highest possible compliment. A chair that nobody notices is a chair that has done its job completely. Chapter 5. The 20th Century, Modernism, Art, and the Spuss Age. There is a moment in the early 20th century when designers stopped asking, "How should a chair look?" and started asking something far more radical. What should a chair be? That shift in question, quiet as it sounds, changed everything. It pulled the chair out of the drawing rooms of aristocrats and the workshops of patient craftsmen and threw it directly into the middle of one of the most turbulent, creative, and contradictory centuries humanity had ever lived through. The chair, that simple object, became a kind of battlefield for ideas about beauty, function, democracy, and eventually the future itself. To understand how that happened, you have to start in a small city in Germany, in the years just after the First World War. The war had shattered a lot of things, not just bodies and borders, but also the old certainties about culture and decoration and what art was supposed to be for. A school opened in Weimar in 1919 called the Bauhaus, and its founding ambition was almost impossibly idealistic. It wanted to close the gap between fine art and practical craft. It wanted to make beautiful things that ordinary people could actually use. Its motto, more or less, was that form should follow function, meaning that the shape of an object should grow naturally from what that object needs to do, not from ornament, not from tradition, not from a desire to impress. The teachers and students at the Bauhaus looked at the world around them and saw the materials of the modern age: steel, glass, industrial metal, tubular pipes. These were not the materials of delicate cabinet makers working slowly with fine-grained wood. These were the materials of factories and bridges and machines. And a young Hungarian designer named Marcel Breuer, who had studied and then taught at the Bauhaus, looked at his bicycle one day and had an idea that now sounds almost obvious, but at the time was genuinely strange. He looked at the curved, hollow steel tubing of the bicycle frame and thought, you could make a chair out of that. The result, which he completed around 1925, became known as the Vasily chair, named after the painter Vasily Kandinsky, who was teaching at the Bauhaus at the time and apparently admired the design. The chair is extraordinary to look at, even now. It has no wood, no upholstery in the traditional sense, just a geometric arrangement of gleaming tubular steel and flat strips of canvas or leather stretched across the frame for the seat, the back, and the armrests. It looks like a drawing of a chair, almost like the abstracted skeleton of something. It looks like a machine. And that was precisely the point. Breuer and his colleagues believed that the machine was not something to be afraid of or hidden behind floral carvings and velvet cushions. The machine was honest. The machine was the spirit of the age. A chair that looked like a machine for sitting, they felt, was more truthful than a chair that pretended to be something from another century. The Bauhaus School was eventually forced to close by the rising Nazi government in 1933, but its ideas had already escaped into the world, carried by the designers and teachers who scattered across Europe and America. The philosophy of form following function, of stripping objects down to their essential geometry, of using industrial materials without apology, all of that became the seed of what we now call modernism in design, and it would flower most beautifully, perhaps, in the hands of two people working in California a decade or so later. Charles and Ray Eames are difficult to describe without making them sound like a legend, which is unfortunate because they were real people with very specific obsessions and a very specific way of working. Charles had trained as an architect. Ray had studied painting and abstract art. They married in 1941 and set up a studio in Los Angeles. And from that studio, they would produce some of the most beloved and recognizable furniture of the entire 20th century. Their guiding idea was a phrase that Charles used often. They wanted to make the best for the most for the least, not the best for the richest, not the most exclusive, but the most thoughtful, the most human, the most carefully considered design, available to as many people as possible, at a price that did not require wealth. To do that, they needed new technology. And they found it, in a way, through the war. During the Second World War, the United States military had a pressing need for lightweight, strong-shaped materials. Soldiers who were wounded needed splints for broken limbs, and those splints needed to be durable, but light enough to carry. The solution came partly through experiments with molding plywood, bending and shaping thin layers of wood under heat and pressure into curved anatomical forms. Charles and Ray had actually been experimenting with this technique before the war, trying to create furniture, and when the military contacted them to help develop molded plywood splints, they threw themselves into it, refining the process enormously. When the war ended and they returned to thinking about chairs, they had years of hard-won expertise in how to shape wood into curves that followed the human body. The molded plywood chairs they produced in the late 1940s were unlike anything that had come before them. The seat and backrest were separate pieces of curved plywood, each shaped to cradle the body in a way that felt almost biological. They were attached to simple metal legs, rubber shock mounts between the wood and metal absorbing vibration and giving the chair a slight, pleasant flexibility. They were relatively inexpensive to produce. They were genuinely beautiful. Yet, and they worked, not just visually, but physically, in the way they held a person. The molded plywood chair was only the beginning. Through the 1950s, Charles and Ray experimented with fiberglass, with wire mesh, with plastics, always trying to find new ways to make good design accessible. But the piece that became their most iconic creation came later in 1956, And it was, perhaps a little ironically, not their most democratic work. The Eames lounge chair is a large, deeply cushioned chair with a matching ottoman, its shell made of molded plywood veneered in warm wood, its cushions thick and inviting, its base a graceful 5-star aluminum pedestal. It was expensive then, and it is expensive now. Charles said he wanted it to have the warm, receptive look of a well-used first baseman's mitt, and that is exactly what it has. It looks like somewhere you would sink into at the end of a long day and not want to leave. The Eames lounge chair became a cultural object almost immediately. It appeared in films and television programs. It became a symbol of a certain kind of thoughtful, cultivated taste. The taste of someone who cared about design, but also about comfort, who did not want to choose between beauty and softness. It was, in its own way, a descendant of the bergère chairs of the French salons 2 centuries earlier. The idea that a chair could be a private retreat, a small kingdom of ease. Only now, that retreat was available not just to aristocrats, but to anyone who could save up enough, or who happened to sit in one in a waiting room or a doctor's office or a design museum. While the Eames were shaping wood and fiberglass in California, something else entirely was happening in Europe. The 1960s brought a kind of giddy optimism about the future, about technology, about space travel and synthetic materials, and the possibility that design could be as free as imagination itself. Plastic, which had existed in various forms since the late 19th century, was becoming cheaper and more versatile, and designers looked at it the way Brewer had looked at steel tubing, as the honest material of the age, something to be celebrated rather than hidden. A Danish designer named Werner Panton had been thinking about plastic chairs for years, and in 1967 he finally produced what he had been imagining. The Panton chair is a single piece of molded plastic, no legs attached separately, no joints, no separate seat and back. It is one continuous flowing S-shaped curve, cantilevered so that you sit on what is essentially a wave, the chair holding your weight through the geometry of its form rather than through 4 legs planted on the ground. It is sculptural in a way that few chairs had ever been. It looks like it belongs in a science fiction film. It looks, to be honest, like a chair designed for a world that had not quite arrived yet. The Panton chair was genuinely difficult to manufacture at first, and the materials needed to make it strong enough took years to perfect. But when it finally came together, it demonstrated something important. That plastic could be more than a cheap substitute for other materials. In the right hands, it could do things wood and metal simply could not. It could be seamless. It could be any color. It could flow. And then there is the other plastic chair, the one that exists in a completely different world from the Panton. You have almost certainly sat in one. You may be near one right now. It is white or sometimes green or blue or red, and has 4 simple legs and a slightly curved back, and it weighs almost nothing, and it costs almost nothing. It is called the monoblock, and it is, by most estimates, the most common chair on earth. No one is entirely sure where it originated. The design seems to have emerged gradually in the 1970s from several manufacturers working in similar directions. But at some point, a mold was made for a single-piece, injection-molded polypropylene chair that could be produced in enormous quantities and sold for very little money. The monoblock spread everywhere. It is in the cafés of South America and the street markets of West Africa and the back gardens of Europe and the plastic-covered restaurants of Southeast Asia. It is, in a strange way, the most democratic object the history of the chair has ever produced. Any person in almost any country can own one. They stack. They are light enough for a child to carry. When one breaks, you simply get another. But the monoblock also carries a shadow. It is made from petroleum-derived plastic, and it does not biodegrade in any meaningful human time frame. When it breaks, it often ends up in a landfill or in places without adequate waste infrastructure, in the soil or the ocean. The chair that is everywhere is also a small, persistent environmental wound, multiplied by the hundreds of millions. There is something almost poetic and deeply uncomfortable about that. The object that finally, truly democratized the act of sitting, of having a place to rest, is also one that the planet does not know what to do with. The 20th century gave the chair to everyone, in other words, and then handed everyone a quiet problem to sit with. Chapter 6. The Ergonomic Crisis, the Office Chair. For most of human history, the body was in motion. People farmed, walked, carried, built, and moved through their days in ways that kept the muscles and spine in a constant low-grade conversation with gravity. Even the factory workers of the Industrial Revolution, as brutal as their conditions were, spent their hours standing, lifting, and moving along production lines. The idea of a person sitting perfectly still at a desk for 8, 9, 10 hours in a row would have seemed not just unusual to someone from the 1800s, but genuinely strange, almost unnatural. And as it turns out, they would have been right to think so. The 20th century changed the human body's relationship with work in a way that no previous era had managed. As economies shifted from making physical things to processing information, millions of people migrated away from the factory floor and into the office. First, it was clerks and secretaries and managers. Then, as the decades rolled forward and computers arrived, the population of desk-bound workers swelled into the hundreds of millions. By the end of the century, sitting had become the dominant physical posture of modern labor. You sat to do your work, you sat to eat your lunch, you sat to commute home, you sat to watch television in the evening. A full day could pass, and the human body, which had evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to walk across savannas and climb and crouch and squat, had barely moved at all. The spine, it turns out, did not adapt gracefully to this arrangement. The human back is not a straight column, but a gentle S-curve, a design that distributes the weight of the upper body across a series of vertebrae, cushioned by discs and supported by layers of muscle. When you walk, those muscles are active. The discs are being gently compressed and decompressed, and blood moves through the tissues with relative ease. But when you sit, especially when you sit in the slightly slumped, slightly forward way that most people naturally drift into after an hour at a desk, the geometry changes. The natural curve of the lower back, the lumbar region, begins to flatten. The discs in that area take on uneven pressure. The muscles that are supposed to hold everything in alignment slowly switch off, because sitting asks so little of them. And then, hour after hour, the damage accumulates quietly in the way that most damage does, without any single moment you can point to and say that was when it went wrong. By the 1980s, back pain had become one of the most common medical complaints in the industrialized world, and researchers and designers began asking a question that sounds simple but turned out to be surprisingly complex. What does a chair actually need to do in order to support the human body properly? The answers they found challenged almost everything that furniture had assumed up to that point. Traditional office chairs, even the upholstered adjustable ones that had been standard issue in corporate offices for decades, were designed around a fairly static idea of sitting. You sat down, the chair held you up, and that was essentially the entire relationship. But the body, researchers discovered, does not want to be held still. It wants to shift and tilt and adjust. The muscles around the spine need small, constant movements to stay engaged. Sitting truly motionless, it turned out, was almost as harmful as sitting badly. What the body needed was not a chair that locked it into one correct position, but a chair that moved with it, encouraged subtle adjustments, and kept the spine in a supported but never rigid relationship with the seat. This understanding slowly filtered into the world of furniture design, and in 1994, a chair arrived that tried to answer all of these questions at once: the Herman Miller. Aeron chair did not look like anything that had come before it. Where other office chairs were upholstered in foam and fabric, soft and cushioned and visually reassuring, the Aeron was made of a taut, breathable mesh stretched across a hard frame. It had no padding in the traditional sense. Its back was divided into two zones that could flex independently. It had a mechanism that allowed the seat to tilt forward or recline, following the movement of the person sitting in it rather than resisting it. Looked at from across a room, it resembled less a piece of furniture and more a piece of medical equipment, something you might find in a laboratory that studied human movement. It was expensive, significantly more expensive than any office chair had a reasonable right to be, and when it launched, it was met with some skepticism. But then something interesting happened. The dot-com boom of the late 1990s created a new kind of office culture, one where technology companies were awash in venture capital and desperate to attract talented engineers and programmers. Suddenly, the Aeron chair became a symbol. Rows of Aeron chairs in an open-plan office said something about the company that owned them. It said they took their employees seriously. It said they were modern, progressive, scientifically minded. The chair became so closely identified with the tech industry boom that when that bubble burst in the early 2000s, liquidators selling off the assets of failed startups would photograph walls of Aeron chairs stacked in empty offices, and those images became almost iconic shorthand for the whole era. But beyond the status and the symbolism, the Aeron had genuinely moved the conversation about sitting forward. It had made the biomechanics of the seated body visible almost literally through its transparent mesh surfaces and exposed mechanical components. It looked like it was thinking about the body, which in a way it was. The science of sitting continued to evolve in the years that followed, and some of its conclusions were uncomfortable in more than the physical sense. Studies began to suggest that even a well-designed chair did not fully solve the problem, because the problem was not just how you sat, but how long you sat. Researchers looking at the health outcomes of sedentary workers found associations between prolonged sitting and a range of conditions that went beyond back pain, including cardiovascular issues, metabolic problems, and effects on mood and cognition. Some writers and scientists began using a phrase that felt deliberately provocative. Sitting, they said, was the new smoking. It was a comparison designed to shock, and it did because it reframed a completely ordinary, apparently harmless activity as a slow, cumulative health risk that most people were accumulating every day without thinking about it. The response, in offices and in living rooms, was a wave of new products and habits. Standing desks appeared. Adjustable desks that moved up and down became popular. People set timers to remind themselves to stand and walk every hour. Some offices introduced treadmill desks, which allowed people to walk very slowly while working. though these never quite caught on in the way their inventors hoped. The ergonomic chair had solved one problem and quietly revealed another. It had made sitting more comfortable, more supportive, more intelligent in its design. But no chair, however brilliantly engineered, could change the fundamental fact that the human body was built for movement, and that the modern world, for all its ingenuity, had arranged itself in a way that made movement increasingly optional. The chair had become, in a sense, almost too good at its job. Chapter 7: Gaming Thrones and the Future. There is something quietly poetic about where we end up after all of this. After the jeweled thrones of Egypt, after the klizmos chairs of Athens, after the bentwood bistro seats of Parisian cafes and the molded plywood curves of mid-century living rooms, we find ourselves here, in the blue light of a bedroom at night, watching someone play a video game on the internet. And what are they sitting on? A throne. A very deliberate, very visible throne. The gaming chair arrived somewhat unexpectedly, as many cultural objects do. A company called Dix Razor, which had originally manufactured seats for high-performance sports cars, found itself with excess inventory after the automotive industry slowed down. Rather than let those seats gather dust, they began marketing them toward a new kind of person who spent long hours in a fixed position, someone who needed support, who needed comfort, and it turned out, who needed to be seen. The early gaming chairs borrowed everything from the racing world: the bucket seat shape hugging the body on both sides, the tall headrest, the adjustable lumbar pillow, and the bold color schemes in red and black, yellow and black, colors that said speed and intensity rather than anything you would find in a quiet sitting room. What happened next was almost inevitable, because it was about identity. As streaming platforms grew and people began broadcasting their gaming sessions to thousands, sometimes millions of viewers, the chair behind the person became part of the visual language of the stream. It was background, it was branding, it was personality. A streamer sitting in a plain office chair communicated something very different from one enthroned in a towering, aggressive gaming seat. And so the chair, quite suddenly, returned to one of its oldest functions: not ergonomics, not convenience, but status. The message was the same one a pharaoh's elevated seat had sent thousands of years before. Look where I am sitting. Look at what kind of person I am. It is a strange loop when you think about it slowly. The chair began as an object of power, reserved for kings and gods and those who spoke with the authority of institutions. Over centuries, it was democratized, industrialized, cheapened, and made available to everyone. And then, in the early 21st century, a generation of young people found a way to make it a throne again, not through scarcity or political power, but through the theater of the internet. And now, as we look forward, the chair seems to be entering yet another transformation, though this one is quieter and perhaps more practical. Designers and engineers have begun building chairs that are not just passive objects you sit in, but active systems that respond to you. There are chairs being developed, and some already on the market, that use sensors to monitor your posture in real time, gently alerting you when you have been slouching or when your weight has been distributed unevenly for too long. Some connect to your phone, tracking how many hours you have spent seated and suggesting movement. It is a strange thing to imagine. A chair that notices you, that pays attention to your body the way a good physiotherapist might. There is also a growing conversation around sustainability. The furniture industry, like most industries, carries a significant environmental weight, with materials that are difficult to recycle and production processes that consume enormous energy. Some designers are experimenting with 3D printing using recycled or biodegradable materials, creating chairs that can be customized to a person's exact body shape and then, at the end of their life, broken down and remade into something else entirely. Whether this will scale into something widely available remains to be seen, but the intention is there. A desire to make the chair not just comfortable, but responsible. And then there is the quieter, more philosophical question hiding beneath all of this. The human body did not evolve to sit. We know that now. We have known it for a while. The chair, for all its history and elegance and ingenuity, has in many ways been working against our biology for centuries. Some researchers and designers wonder if the future belongs less to the chair and more to furniture that encourages us to shift, to squat, to recline, to move through a range of positions rather than staying locked in one place for 8 or 10 hours at a time. So perhaps the most honest thing to say is that the chair story is not finished. It began as a symbol of divine authority in a desert kingdom, and it has traveled through every revolution, every war, every shift in how human beings live and work and rest. It has been a throne, a tool, an art object, a status symbol, and a health hazard, sometimes all at once. And tonight, it is the thing you are most likely resting in or near, without giving it much thought at all.